Hey, deep divers. You know how we're always digging into the Bhagavad Gita, trying to unpack these big ideas, right? Well, today we're going even deeper into this whole thing about suffering.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this particular excerpt you shared is that, we've talked before about attachment being that root cause of suffering in the Gita.
Right, right. Like that's kind of a given at this point.
Exactly. But this time, we're not just talking about attachment in a general sense. We're getting into the nitty-gritty of how suffering actually works, like a step-by-step breakdown, 6 steps to be precise.
6 steps. Okay, so it's like a roadmap to our own misery.
Yeah.
I'm in. What's step one?
Well, step 1 is all about where suffering actually resides, and it might not be where we'd expect. It basically says that suffering isn't out there in the world, in the external events themselves. It's internal. It's in our minds.
Hmm. It's not the situations themselves, but how we choose to see them. I think I'm starting to see where this is going.
Exactly. They actually give the example of poverty. So let's say someone is experiencing poverty. Their body's reaction to starvation, that's purely physical, right? It's
Yeah.
simply a physical state. But it's the mind that adds all that extra suffering on top of it. The fear, the anxiety, the despair, the sense of lack. That's all manufactured in the mind.
Wow, that's actually a really helpful distinction to make. It's like we have this internal amplifier that can take a neutral situation and crank up the volume on the suffering. So if step one is about locating the suffering, what's step two?
Step 2 is all about how that suffering manifests. And surprise, surprise, it's through our emotions. All
Mhm.
those fun things like anger, anxiety, fear, grief, the whole gang's here.
Oh, tell me about it. They really know how to take over sometimes, those emotions. But it's interesting how this ancient wisdom from the Gita lines up so well with modern psychology. Our emotions really do color our entire experience of the world, don't they?
Absolutely. And that brings us to step 3, which is where things start to get a little bit, well, unsettling. Step 3 is saying that suffering isn't something that comes and goes. It's always present within us. Like it's either actively causing us pain or it's lying dormant, just waiting for a trigger to set it off.
Whew, that's a bit intense, but I can't say it's entirely unfamiliar. It's like even when you're feeling relatively content, there's still that underlying awareness of how quickly things can change. Like a storm cloud that could roll in at any moment. Have you ever felt that?
All the time. And that brings us to step 4, which loops back to what we were talking about earlier about internal versus external.
You mean about how we're always trying to fix the external stuff when the real problem is internal?
Yes. Step 4 is saying that while the trigger for our suffering is often external, like something that happens to us, it's our internal reaction that actually causes the suffering. The event itself is neutral, but our minds are what transform it into something painful.
Right? Like they use that example of being cheated on. Being cheated on, that's a pretty awful experience, but they're making a distinction between the act itself and our reaction to it.
Exactly. So the act of cheating, that's external. But the feelings of betrayal, the anger, the resentment, all those things that really amplify the suffering, that's all internal.
So it's not about trying to create this perfect little bubble for ourselves where nothing bad ever happens because, let's face it, that's never going to happen. It's about learning to work with our own minds so we can respond to those inevitable curveballs in a way that doesn't create even more suffering. That's the pretty useful takeaway, I'd say.
Totally. And that leads us to step 5, which takes this whole idea to a whole other level. Step 5 is claiming that everyone suffers all the time, even if it doesn't look like it on the surface.
Wait, hold on, everyone. All the time. Are we talking about constant, never-ending misery here?
Yeah.
That seems a bit extreme, even for the Gita.
It does, right. But they give some interesting points to back up this claim. Want to hear them?
Lay it on me. Convince me why we're all supposedly suffering all the time.
Okay, so their first point is this feeling of incompleteness that seems to be pretty universal to the human experience, this feeling like something is missing. And this lack is often what drives us to set goals and constantly strive for something more.
Yeah, that's definitely relatable. It's like no matter how much we achieve or acquire, there's always this nagging sense that something else is needed.
Yeah.
We always seem to be wanting more.
Exactly. And this ties right into their second point, which is this: the universal pursuit of happiness. Whether you're a beggar on the street or a king on a throne, everyone is ultimately seeking some form of fulfillment, some kind of lasting happiness.
Oh, 100%. It's
Uh-huh.
like we're all on this endless treadmill, chasing after whatever we think is going to finally bring us that elusive feeling of contentment. And, it makes you wonder, is true happiness even possible?
That's the million-dollar question, right? But it gets even more interesting. Their third point is that our problems tend to change forms throughout our lives rather than actually disappear.
Oh, that is so true. As soon as we solve one problem, another one pops up to take its place. It's like when we're kids, we're worried about toys, then it's grades, then relationships, then our careers. The problems just evolve right along with us.
Exactly. And even when we do experience those fleeting moments of genuine joy and pleasure, like when we achieve a goal or something good happens, the source is quick to remind us that these moments are always intertwined with the potential for pain, like two sides of the same coin.
It's like we can't have one without the other. Like the capacity for both immense joy and immense suffering, it's just woven into what it means to be human. But if that's the case, are we just doomed to suffer forever?
Well, that's where step 6 comes in. This one really gets to the heart of the issue. Step 6 is saying that we're constantly trying to fix the external causes of our suffering when the real problem is actually internal. We keep looking for external solutions to an internal problem.
So we're basically putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone, hoping that'll fix it.
Exactly. And they use a really simple but powerful example to illustrate this. Imagine a child who desperately wants a balloon, right? You buy them the balloon, they're ecstatic for like 5 seconds, and then what happens?
I think we all know where this is going. They spot a chocolate bar, and suddenly that balloon has lost all its appeal. On to the next desire.
Exactly. It's like we're chasing our own tails, constantly seeking fulfillment and satisfaction in things outside of ourselves, when real contentment, lasting peace, it has to come from within.
That is deep, really deep. Okay, so we've laid out this pretty comprehensive and honestly kind of bleak picture of suffering. Where do we go from here?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's what makes this next part so interesting, because this excerpt, it leaves us right at this pivotal moment where Krishna is about to respond to Arjuna's refusal to fight.
It's like a cliffhanger ending. And what's really interesting is that this is the first time Krishna is going to directly address Arjuna's defiance. Everything up until this point has been more about laying out the bigger picture of the Gita's philosophy.
Exactly. This is where things start to get really practical, because now, faced with Arjuna's very real and very relatable anguish, Krishna can't just offer these general principles anymore. He's got to get specific. He has to offer a path forward, a way to move through the world with, hopefully, a little more wisdom and a little less suffering.
Okay, now you're just teasing me. What does he say?
Well, you'll have to wait for our next deep dive to find out.
Ugh, fine. But listeners, you better believe I'm going to be holding you to that. We'll be back soon.